everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We're just going to give you a couple of minutes to join and then we are good to go.
I see the participant meter rising.
Exactly that's what we like to see. Perfect. Well, thanks for joining, everyone. It's going to give you a couple more minutes to join, and then we're good to go.
Buenos Aires.
Yes.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Can, Robin.
All right, I was having a little issue there.
Perfect. Well, we'll just kick things off. So hello and welcome to the CPRS webinar discussing contract compliance and spend review. I'm Bridget Robinson, Project Director at Reuters Events and the organizer and one of the partners of today's webinar. As some of you may already know, I'm one of the conference directors for the Downstream Leadership Forum 2020, happening on November 19th to 20th, which this webinar is being released in connection to, and where both where CPRS are sponsoring. Where they're sponsoring, and where the likes of the CEOs of Dow and Chemours, as well as executive directors and the likes of Shell and BASF are joining forces and sharing insight with you guys in order to create a more sustainable, resilient and smarter business strategies in the downstream industry. Before things kick off, I just wanted to say from our team to yours, I hope you're all doing okay in these uncertain times and that you and your families are keeping safe, sound and sane during the global pandemic. Before we kick off today, there's just a few bits of housekeeping that we'll go through. But first off, as headwinds continue, projects, asset and portfolio optimization are at the forefront of every decision maker's mind. Now more than ever, driving efficiency in your company's CAPEX and OPEX is as important as ever. Well, have no fear, Reuters Events is here with our trusted industry partner, CPRS, to discuss contract compliance and spend review and its impact it can have on your company's operations. Now for the housekeeping. So just a brief bit of housekeeping before we start. This webinar will last approximately 50 to 60 minutes and is being recorded. So we will send you the full audio recordings next week, just in case you wanted to listen again. Please do ask any questions as and when they pop up. Simply send them through the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen. Our panelists will answer your questions at the end of the webinar, where we have allotted around 15 to 10 minutes or so for an audience Q&A. So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists. First up, we have Joanne Murphy, Director of Operations and Contract Compliance at CPRS. Next up, after that, we have Robin Harris, Global Director of Project Controls for Phillips 66. And then finally, but certainly not least, we have Brian Barr, the Contracts and Compliance Supervisor for Marathon Petroleum Corporation. How are you guys doing today?
Good.
Excellent. How about yourself?
Today's a good day.
Not too bad.
Friday.
Yes.
Doing great.
Yeah, exactly. Friday afternoon here, so it's almost the weekend. Hurrah! But anyway, we'll go on to the webinar and start off everyone else's Fridays correctly. So obviously we're going to be discussing a few things, but we have some really great questions that we as panelists have decided to answer for you guys in order to create some really great discussion and provide some really good insight. But first off, I suppose is the kind of overall question is, what are the common issues that cause invoice overpayments? First off, I'll probably go to you, Robin.
And what are the common issues that cause invoice overpayment? Is one of the main issues would be that we just don't know, and people that are actually reviewing don't know the contract, don't know that what they should be paying for if things were already included in the pre-negotiated terms. And so primarily one of the biggest things that we see would be the fact that we just don't know all the time what we're supposed to be paying for.
Sure. And Joanne?
Yeah, Robin brings up a great point. Oftentimes the people in the cost control program that are reviewing those invoices, they have other duties as well. And so they're often pressed to get the invoice paid within the payment cycle and don't always know what the contract terms are. So the invoices end up being maybe given a reasonableness test, but not the deep level of testing that is often required when you're dealing with, turnarounds and larger projects where you've got a lot of there's a lot of exposure. And so just that, that little bit of disconnect in the realization that specialization really needs to happen in this space where you have a prepay invoice review team that's assisting your cost controllers in the field to ensure that that disconnect doesn't happen and the invoices are still paid timely. And you can have that assurance that whatever type of issue might be in that invoice is remediated on the front end. And so, yeah, it's that misunderstanding of the contracts that Robin indicated, but also we have found that there's these silos of communication between the folks in the field who are negotiating the contracts and the people that are actually putting the invoices together inside of the vendor's organization, and then reviewing the invoices in the customer's organization as well. And so what PPIR teams can do is bridge that communication gap so that everybody's on the same page and the processes flow a lot smoother, especially when you've got that driver of the project itself and the time limits and the stress of some of those larger projects where you've shut an entire plant down and you've got to get it back up operating as soon as possible. So.
And Robin, following that kind of, I suppose, that misconnect or miscommunication that Joanne was talking about, is what do you, I suppose, do you have anything to add in terms of what you were discussing that, people just don't necessarily know what they're doing sometimes, and kind of adding on to what Joanne was saying?
Yeah, well, it's not just the person paying the invoice. In many cases, we've seen where it's actually the vendor sending in the invoice, right? Everyone doesn't understand that there may be multiple layers to either base contracts and things that have gotten added at the purchase order level that now becomes part of the expectation. Like Joanne mentioned, many times when we have people reviewing an invoice or reviewing costs that are coming in, they're looking for reasonableness. They're looking for, are the rates correct? Not necessarily should we have in fact paid for a certain item, or even should we have in fact been billed for a certain item. So it works both ways where we see the gaps, right? None of it seems to be intentional, right? They don't intend to bill us incorrectly, and we don't intend to pay for things we shouldn't. But it all looks legitimate when it comes through a system or process.
Sure. No, that's so true. And I suppose, Brian, what are some of the misconceptions that cause organizations to believe that their cost control strategies are satisfactory?
Well, I do agree with Robin or Joanne that organizations do have a belief that the approver's skills, access to the contract, understanding the contract, and that disconnect leads to overpayments. But frankly, some organizations don't even check to see whether the process is broken. My experience is that about 1 out of every 11 invoices that comes in from a contractor probably has an error. It's pretty easy to analyze your AP data to determine whether any of those invoices have been returned. So if you don't have a 1 out of 11 error rate, then you might have an opportunity. So the first thing is that they don't know it's broke. The second is that there are often cultural and systematic limitations to implementing an invoice review program of any type. Leaders can be change averse, And frankly, implementation of an invoice review program takes resources and a commitment to a reasonable time frame to let the process mature. And finally, frankly, some organizations think it's more valuable to find find errors that have already occurred and recoup losses than it is to avoid creating the error in the first place by making sure the invoice is right. So it tends to be easier to go back later and review than it is to put in place a prepay invoice review.
And I suppose this question is more for Robin, actually. You know, what are the kind of communication strategies for overcoming this kind of internal, I suppose, resistance to the implementation of cost control programs that I suppose Brian was kind of talking about, and also, you know, the likes that Joanne does with CPRS?
Some of the things that we do is when we're, especially in a turnaround environment, we implement or institute steering teams so that we get rid of the silos and we're doing the cross communication and we're driving home the importance of appropriate controls, not just with invoice payment, but within everything, because we may be paying invoices, but the controls on the cost could be coming from invoice increases due to change orders. So, right, adding controls across the board, making sure all of the organization, whether you're in procurement, you're in maintenance, or you're in process or operations, making sure everyone understands where we are, the changes that we are making, because if we do impact what the supplier is bringing to the table, meaning more or less, then those invoices change. And so we understand that, to make sure everybody is aware of the impact that they're bringing to the table.
Sure. And Brian, do you agree with that, or does that kind of, I suppose, match up with, you know, this kind of putting some resources towards this kind of overcoming the internal resistance, I suppose?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's important to match the process to the resources that you're going to need to make sure it's right, and acknowledge that it takes time to get it right. These things have to be optimized. They're not always perfect going in. So it takes a continual optimization process to make sure that you have the right resources looking at the right things.
Right.
Definitely.
Yeah, and that continual optimization is definitely, you know, one of the benefits of having a real-time prepayment invoice review. And to Brian's point about that predisposition of leaders to just kind of go with the status quo, you know, post-pay audits can be very successful. The idea of prepayment invoice review is easily accepted and identified with, because it's pretty apparent what the benefits are. But like anything that is going to shift a consciousness level, you almost need a crisis event or some sort of a paradigm shifting event, like COVID-19, for instance, is a crisis level event. And so now in this industry in particular, you are going to have, or you do have, open audit exceptions that the collectability is nil, because those organizations are no longer in business, unfortunately. So you've got just widespread layoffs, closures of enterprises, and bankruptcies that really limit your ability to collect on some of those larger post-pay claims that you had, quite frankly, may have factored into your cash flow for that year. And so this event definitely reinforces the need to go ahead and shift with the shift, you know, and open your mindset to the idea of a prepayment invoice review program and capturing those exceptions on the front end.
Yeah.
Now, go ahead, Robin.
And I'd like to add to that when you say a crisis, imagine being in a turnaround, you're $100 million in a $100 million event, and you're trying to figure out how to stop an overrun, right? We start to scrutinize a lot, and one of the things we don't want to have to worry about is the fact that we're overrunning because we've been overpaying on things we should not have. And so there's always a form or some form of when we need to begin really, really looking at it. And you don't want to be doing that when you're in trouble, which is the crisis, right? So always really, really be looking at it.
Exactly. Yeah. Agreed.
Sure. And we've been talking a lot, a bit about, I suppose, optimizing that strategy. But for the two, I suppose, owner operators on the call, or the webinar, should I say, how do you measure the success or failure of a cost control program? Robin, I'll put that one to you first.
It's always a success when you know where you are, and when you know where you're going. So ideally, knowing where you are means you've gotten the data acquisition and the cost tracking and the cost payables correct and appropriate, so you can get your accruals and get all of your accounting business right. So knowing where you are, but then more importantly, knowing where you're going. And so looking at the indicators and being able to trend out. And so those would be the biggest two things when knowing that your cost control, your project controls organization is doing what they should be doing. They can tell you where they are at the very moment and where you're headed if you keep on this path.
Absolutely.
Brian, for you, what would you say? How do you kind of measure success and failure?
Well, the bean counter is going to come out in me here. I
resent that word.
I am one. So there's some very specific metrics that you can monitor around invoice review processes. There is a definite ROI. There's definite cost per invoice for the operation. You can measure your reduction in error rate on invoices over time. So there are, aside from the effects on the overall process of knowing where you are and making sure you're not overpaying, you can really apply some key metrics to the operation to justify its ongoing existence, other than, it feels good to make sure you're paying invoices right. So I would encourage people to identify the key metrics that are important to your organization, put them in place, and monitor it over time, because prepay invoice review is a relatively new thought process, and frankly, we have to justify it. It has to have a return. So I always look at those key metrics.
Sure. And Joanne, I suppose from the service provider standpoint, for you guys, when you, I suppose, are working with a client on this kind of process, how do you define success and failure?
In the same way, for us, the success is that initial step of enterprises opening their thought processes to a new way of doing things, and all that comes with that. But we do have some really good metrics and some tenure now, so that would contribute some of those, with some of those results, right? And that's where that 3% comes in. We've observed minimum 3% recovery, but it's generally between 1 and 9%. And there have been instances we've actually seen over 9%, depending on the issues. But in terms of, so if you can use that like 3% as that lower benchmark, and that is something that will return material hard cash for you, then you can open your mind to the other benefits too, right? And that is the, dealing with the problems in the current period. Making sure that your governing agreements are more readily understood by more people. The more the vendor's staff knows what their agreements have been, what agreements have been entered into, the better their invoicing practices. So as part of having this program in place, you're actually improving processes for them. You're improving processes for your client because the invoices are getting reviewed against the contract terms and the proposals in real time. You're posting the recoveries and you're preventing the loss in the current period, which is a win-win for everybody. But in order to do that, what we found is it really requires people with specialized skill sets. Not only do they have to know how to test that, you know, $60,000 invoice that's all mileage at 55 cents a mile, and it just comes in as, you know, hundreds of line items of names. You know, how do you ensure that the folks that are qualified for mileage get mileage? And if you don't know what the agreements state, you're not going to even know what to look for. You're going to say, oh, well, that looks fancy, and you're going to stamp it, and it's going to get approved. Well, in truth, the contracts nearly all of the time have a provision of they have to meet certain objectives to get mileage. And it's kind of understood, if you are a passenger in someone's vehicle, you're not going to get paid mileage, because it generally states mileage is paid to the driver. And so if you've got a team of skilled folks in place that know how to design a template, test for this, make it part of their regular process, request the, you know, the requisite support, then they can identify all of the persons that were passengers. And this is a real world situation that we had. We ended up identifying more than $20,000 in folks that were passengers that should never have been paid mileage in the first place. And so that's just, you know, one of the examples. I got off point there, but
no, not at all. That's great.
One of the things I'll add to that, Joanne, is a lot of times we get a little bit too comfortable with the digitization and automation, making sure that we have all these new tools and checkpoints and review processes in place. And because we're so far removed from the paper process that we believe the system just works, right? It doesn't mean that that you don't have inappropriate or incorrect rates entered, or where many times there's this unassigned or there's this miscellaneous that comes through. We just believe the process works because it's digital, when in reality that's even more of a case that we could have errors that are going unnoticed because things are happening at a lot quicker pace and are just bypassed because we believe that you have intellect or something behind the system that's driving you appropriate checks and balances, when in fact there isn't.
Exactly.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, I suppose, what would you say are the advantages and disadvantages of or advantages / disadvantages of a prepayment invoice review versus that kind of post-payment audit that we've kind of, I suppose, discussed a bit in this webinar so far, because often it's quite hard to kind of, I suppose, do things in hindsight as opposed to prepare beforehand. But Brian, I know that you kind of have a few thoughts on this.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts in that space. First, there is definitely a place for prepay and post-pay review. They kind of do different things. Their returns are about the same, but their effects are different. Joanne alluded to the current period effect, and it is important that we realize cost savings as quickly as we can instead of waiting to a two or 3 year period out to review invoices. So it's current period effect is important. It also leads to process improvements that happen in real time. And if on a project basis, that's important, because if you do have a misunderstanding about a contract term, or there's a gray area, or there's this disconnect that we've already talked about, it gets realized earlier in the process and gets corrected and resolved. Second point is that in In a post-pay environment, you typically have a settlement between the findings and what is actually paid back, and that settlement can reduce your recovery fairly significantly. And generally down to about 50 cents on the dollar. So it's important that we understand that prepay by nature is 100% recovery, and postpay can go down to as low as 40 cents on the dollar generally. Also in a postpay environment, you have a settlement that is written, and these written settlements could, if done incorrectly, preclude any other audits on that spend, and you can inadvertently forfeit your rights to audits in other spaces. So you've got to be very careful there. Also, the prepay invoice review process is actually fair to the contractor, because any recoveries that are made are current period recoveries. Contractors haven't paid out bonuses, contractors haven't closed their books, neither have we. So that effect is fair to both parties. And I might point out that a lot of people would think that prepay invoice review is very complex. And while the creation of the systems can be complex, the actual activities around it are not. In reality, the invoice comes into your AP department, it gets reviewed. If it's accurate, it goes to an approver that approves it. If it's not accurate, it goes back to the billing department on the contractor side, and it actually happens more at a tactical level. In post-pay review, you're generally getting, managers around a table and deciding who's going to get what. It is a lot more complicated than prepay. Once prepay has been established as a norm and a best practice in your company, it really becomes more transparent. So there are big differences between prepay and postpay. Again, they're great. I think anytime you're paying attention, it's good. But paying attention earlier is better than paying attention later, generally.
Yeah. I suppose kind of the also standardized processes improve that kind of relationship as well. Where that relationship between the contractor and the owner operator is always kind of helpful, and avoids that kind of post settlement process.
Yeah, and Bridget, I'd add that during the prepay process, generally we have periodic business reviews with our vendors. These outputs from this prepay process can be very useful in managing your relationship with your contractor if you incorporate them in those communications with your contractor on an ongoing basis. It's not, at that point, it becomes a little bit more strategic and less tactical, but you can take that tactical work that's done in the prepay review and actually incorporate it into your QBRs, and it ends with a better relationship with your contractor.
And Robin and Joanne, anything to add to that?
I would add that most businesses, if not all, can afford not to do the prepay view. No one wants to overpay on anything in our personal lives or in our business lives. And so getting that prepaid look helps us to be more strategic in where we're spending our money. Getting the prepaid view helps to establish the trends on where we're seeing the errors. That helps aid in the communication back to the contractor, because in many times they just don't know. But we get to see a trend of where the issues are. In that post-pay view, not only does it hurt the contractor because they're having to give money back where they've already distributed their business, but even then, the owner side, we may see a little bit of a return, but it may not go against the project that incurred it, or the organization that incurred it. It may go against the company for credit for something in the future, which doesn't really hit the point of what we were trying to accomplish on the event where we incurred the overrun. The other thing would be that if we're crossing over a calendar year, we could be getting into where it was expense or capital, and we may have messed up on our taxes. There's a lot of different reasons why we don't want to use a back-end system versus getting it right in the first place.
Sure, especially at the moment, when things can, the industry is really adapting at the moment, and some people don't necessarily know what the future will hold. So the credit, as you said, it's not the kind of most stable or best option for people. Joanne, do you have anything to add for that, as from the actual side of the kind of service provider in that?
Absolutely, everything they said is true. Yeah, and a really positive side effect of a prepay review is that relationship preservation element between you and your vendor as well. PPIR reviewers, they bridge that communication gap, and in a way that business can continue. The prepay review cycle can be constructed in a very standardized manner that doesn't impede the payment of invoices to vendors. And that would be one of the concerns that would be raised. It's like, well, with the degree of specialization and the amount of testing that is involved in some of these larger invoices, are the vendors still paid on time? And the answer is absolutely yes. To define the current period for prepay review, it's a 90-day cycle, right? Because it gives the vendor time to put their invoice together. It gives time for the payment terms and the payments to happen, and then for collection after the fact. So best case scenario, you're able to get it reviewed and remediated prior to payment, but it's not the end of the world if the money goes out the door and you have to issue a credit memo request, because you're still issuing it in what's considered the current period. Everyone is aware of the issues, and by the time the invoice gets paid, the issues are being worked on. So the cash is still, the terms of the agreements are still being met, and that alleviates that burden on the vendor, and it doesn't impede the actual P2P cycle within an organization either. So it's just a win-win for everybody. And to the note of discovery, we don't know what we don't know. And so at the very least, prepay should be something that is discussed and maybe piloted to see if there are hidden overpayments happening or hidden contradictions between the way the MSAs are understood and the way they're actually carried out in the field. Are the folks in the supply chain maybe accidentally allowing terms that are in the MSA to be thwarted by things that the vendor puts into their proposals? And now the proposal is made part of the PO, which is part of the contract, and then you have a direct conflict. Well, those things can be remediated, addressed, and negotiated during the current phase of the project, and settlement can be reached before the crisis happens of 2 years from now you're asking for $2 or $3 million because there was this term that was completely ignored, right? So yeah, we don't know what we don't know. And until we actually look, and then when you start looking, the things that you find are surprising. And to Brian's point, it improves the processes in the current contracting process itself. So.
Sure. And in terms of, what can organizations do with contract and purchase order language to help make internal and or external invoice review programs more effective? What can be done there, Joanne?
Standardization would be the first step. Have a standardized set of terms and conditions for your company, and make sure that the people that are involved in the process of negotiating the agreements, writing the POs, approving the proposals and receiving the invoices, know what those terms are. Know your company's standard T's and C's. And look for gray areas when you're negotiating these T's and C's with your vendors. Really look at what they're proposing, not just accept the fact that this rate looks like it's in line with industry. So, you know, it shouldn't really be a check the box activity. Mm-hmm. You should really work to understand what it is you're agreeing to and ensure that when that's made part of the PO, if it's made part of the PO, it doesn't create a conflict because now it's part of the contract. Mm-hmm. And it conflicts with the master service agreement.
Right.
And just look for ways in which vendors will try to circumvent those existing terms. You know, it does happen where vendors will put in the fine print something that they know conflicts with the master agreement. So basically knowing your contracts is the main thing, the standardization, the knowing your contracts, and then communicating what those standard T's and C's are across the organization, and then put controls in place mm-hmm. to validate that the invoices are coming in as expected, because we've currently observed a huge disconnect between folks in the field that are negotiating the agreements and people who are actually reviewing the invoices and approving them for payment. Mm-hmm. There has to be a communication bridge so that they know what to look for. That's right. You know, and so, in a nutshell, standardization, communication.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Robin, do you have anything to add to that? You're nodding your head along with Joanne. I was wondering if you could, if there's anything to add.
Yeah, I would add that just even like Joanne mentioned in the purchase order language, stating that there is a pre-evaluation or a pre-review, prepay review of the invoicing stops a lot of it, right? In cases the contractor pay attention more to what they're sending in. They question it more to make sure that it will get through the quote unquote auditing of what they're submitting. So, you know, we see a lot of things that will try and get by from a contract standpoint. We may have agreed to a rate per resource, but we also may have agreed to a cap on the number of resources that sometimes isn't followed. You'll get as many resources in at a rate when you should have been capped off a long time ago. And if everyone doesn't understand that an automated system may not always capture everything, and you do need an educated set of eyes looking that understands all of the aspects of the contracts, then you could miss a lot.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And Brian?
Well, I think it's important for supply chain organizations to form better alliances with their business clients that they support and provide more value by not allowing the business development guy on the contractor side and the supply chain guy to write a contract and then just flip the contract to the people that actually run the business. I think we really need to build better value there. As Joanne and Robin both pointed out, the communication after the contract is negotiated to the field is critical. And I think more communication during the contract writing process mm-hmm. is critical, because in reality, you have a BD guy on the contractor side and the supply chain guy on the company side, and they often are very much disconnected from the actual operators on the ground, and frankly don't understand how the operators get their work done. So that better communication and better alignment between supply chain and their business clients can lead to better contracts, which leads to better POs, mm-hmm. so that we can identify problems up front. So I think that business relationship is very important.
Yeah, Yeah, no, that's definitely seems to be a running theme within what people are kind of saying on the webinar. You know, that communication is key. Talking of communication, we've actually got a few questions coming in. So I thought we would go to some audience Q&A and kind of, I suppose, recap some of the stuff that we've discussed and dig a bit deeper. There's been a few questions regarding kind of smart contracts and digitalization to improve invoice review time and accuracy, and also kind of people asking about CPRS and if they use kind of smart contract kind of technologies as well, or within your processes and how you work with companies. I know that, you know, Robin, earlier in the webinar, you said that perhaps sometimes people are over reliant on the kind of digitalization of the process, and it kind of leads to kind of almost an overconfidence within what's kind of being processed. Perhaps, you know, is there anything to add, or do you, any other panelists kind of have comments regarding kind of smart contracts and how they're used? Perhaps, you know, are there disadvantages, advantages, any examples of that?
So smart contracts seem to work best when there is a certain amount of standardization in what is being invoiced. So if you're a trucking company and you have a standard field ticket form that's filled out, and it's the same thing over and over and over again, those smart contracts can really speed up that transaction cycle, and those vendors can get paid actually in, you know, shorter terms than the standard net 30, right? But if you have large projects that have a great deal of customization in the work itself, if you've got especially T&M contracts where there are elements related to the way the labor is worked, the way the labor is billed, the points at which the labor rates change within that cycle, the equipment price breaks for certain time periods, the materials markups, sometimes materials markups that differ on the various types of materials that might be used, the travel provisions, their exclusivity in certain instances. It just becomes less and less a candidate for the smart contract model. But we do, however, have, well, within CPRS, and I would assume in other companies, proprietary systems, IT-related systems that we can input some of that standardization and utilize some of that standardization and actually use it as a tool. So, you know, the best PPIR programs have a wide range of customized tool sets that not only are customized for a certain test for a certain project, but can easily be altered, right? Or the program that is putting certain risk factors in front of you as a PPIR analyst, that can be altered in real time. So in terms of what we do specifically is we've got both of those things working in tandem. You know, we have a strong proprietary software that we utilize that can run the invoices through a variety of duplicate checks, so that the cream rises to the top, you know, so that manual process isn't, you know, so labor intensive, right? And then we have tools and processes developed that can take that data, you know, pull it out of the client system or out of our proprietary system and slice and dice it, and the cream rises to the top again, right? So both of those things work in tandem in our organization. But to the point of smart contracts, I'm not saying that they're not great, because they do save a lot of time, but they require a level of standardization that we don't often see in the turnaround environment or the capital expansion environment, where you may even have a lot of discovery happening on the ground of, oh, we didn't know that needed to be done. Now we got to find these contractors to come in, and we got to customize, you know, the contracts and the situation to meet this need we didn't even know we had, and we needed to do it yesterday. So in short, smart contracts are great, but we don't find the need to use a lot of that type of technology because we have in-house technology that's malleable.
Sure. And Robin and Brian, you know, what's your experience with smart contracts? And, you know, do you find that they do improve accuracy, or, you know, I suppose what are the lessons learned around kind of smart contracts?
I'll go with in our environment, or in at least my environment with turnarounds, there's rarely many things that happen routinely. And one of the things that you have to have would be a lot more standardization on the kind of work, the kind of resources, the kind of tools, the kind of overhead, the kind of margin, kind of efficiency from the resources, right? And so when you have a real-time view and look at the contract and what actual costs are coming in at, and you can get that right, you can actually see whether or not your vendor is providing you other services that they were bound to as part of the contract, like a certain productivity that they may not be getting, and you won't recognize that they've not met it until you're too far down the path. And so again, you kind of missed some key compensation back. So I agree with Joanne. You have to be really standardized to take full effect of a smart contract.
Great. And we have a few questions regarding the prepay review process. So how does the contractor behave change once they've become aware of the prepay review process? And also, how do you continue to justify the costs associated with that prepay process once you've kind of announced it?
Okay, well, we'll address the cost issue first. We find that it pays for itself. You know, we've really, we haven't dipped below a 4-to-1 ROI ever in the history of the program. And quite often it's more than that, and we've even seen 10 times ROI. So the program pays for itself. In terms of how the vendors respond, at first they might be like, this is weird, this has never happened before. But once they start working with us and they realize we are the facilitators of positive outcomes, they absolutely love it. We get so many thank you notes from vendors saying, thank you so much for explaining to me how this needs to be invoiced, what this contract provision actually means. And they are so willing to fix it right then, because it also looks good on them too. If they can solve a problem right there, doing their own jobs, and not have to escalate it to management, so that management can focus on getting the actual project done in time, it's a win-win. And so at first there can be that kind of introductory phase where they're, you know, they associate audit, you know, with kind of some negative connotations, but once they actually see the testing that's being performed and the level of communication and expertise, quite frankly, of our reviewers, they feel that they have an ally to make sure that they get their job done more effectively. And then they can be the agents of that positive communication and take what they've learned and disseminate that information within their own company. And so all in all, it's really been a positive experience. That's why it makes it so exciting to talk about, right? And you know, I could probably talk about it for hours and just go down all kinds of rabbit holes and tell all kinds of crazy stories. But, you know, overall, it's, you know, it's just an exciting thing to be on the front of. And it was exciting in the beginning too, but now it's really exciting because we have metrics and we've got history and positive outcomes. that are wonderful to share, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm. Sure,
So,
sure.
so Bridget, I can tell you in the inception when we started this many years ago, there was some resistance from contractors. However, an immediate effect was the number of invoices that were in error, and the recovery rates actually went down over a period of time. Not because, I think only because people understood we were reviewing and we were coming to better understanding. So those error rates generally came down fairly quickly. As Joanne pointed out, there's a great variance, anywhere from 1% to 9%. That generally comes down over time. And that's why the optimization process is important, because you're going to pull contractors. You can't review every dollar. You can in a project environment, but not an MRO environment. So it's important that you get to a satisfactory level and then reconfigure your review processes, whether it's a threshold of invoice that you're looking at, or removing a contractor or adding a different contractor based on incoming or outgoing relationships or projects. So the immediate effect is there is an immediate effect and is positive, because your error rate goes down, and in the end, that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that minimum of 3% just kind of talks for itself, really, doesn't it? You know, in terms of the cost that you can kind of regain. One of the other questions is more about the training that we've kind of talked about, and that kind of constant communication. So, you know, when it's from David Sutherland, and he said it's important that the personnel approving and paying invoices understand the contract terms to avoid issues raised in the call. When do you provide the contract training to these personnel so that they fully understand allowed and unallowed costs? And should this be on a regular basis to take into account any contract changes?
Yes, both.
Yeah, yes.
Oh, Robin, I think will concur, in a project environment, there should be a pre-project effort with everybody that's going to be reviewing invoices to understand the contracts that they're reviewing against, or that they're approving against. Definitely, it's important on projects, but projects are a little bit easier in that regard, because you have a specified project and a specified time frame, and usually a unique contract to it. In the MRO space, it is a little bit more difficult, and you have to revisit with approvers on occasion to make sure that they understand both the variety and the types of spend that they're having to review. So yes and yes.
And my opinion would be, if you have a prepay invoice review team in place, that's what they specialize in. It takes the burden off of everyone. So I would defer to that answer.
I would say, yeah, I mean, all the better if you have a prepay invoice review team in place that are educated in invoice review, because many times we've seen where our teams have tried that by putting in clerks or just people who are good at math or pay attention to detail, is what they say. But if you don't have the right people who understand contractual language in place, which is really a different kind of expertise than just someone who can review an invoice and make sure the rates are correct, I think you're getting away from what companies like CPRS are those that can specialize in making sure that the contract language reads and is interpreted, and everyone is aligned when you do go through the invoice review payment process.
Sure.
I get all the time, I have my invoice reviewer here, and it's, you know, and it's typically a clerk that, you know, is pretty good at reading, but not much else.
Yeah, it really requires a specialized skill set. And one of the fun analogies I came up with early on as we were designing the processes and creating the workflows to pull this off was, you're trying to shoot a moving target while running from a train. And, you know, that's really kind of what it is like in the prepay space, because the moving train is the payment cycle. You need to have those, the contracts understood, the proposals read, the invoices looked at, the testing. You got to figure out your approach, test the invoice, do some sort of a risk assessment, use scoping, strategy, all these skills. And then once you get that figured out, you got to reach out to internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, bridge that communication. And you're trying to get it all done in that, basically that 30-day window, right? That's the, so that's why I used to always joke, we're trying to hit a moving target while running from a train. But conversely, it creates a level of excitement and quite frankly, stress that drives people to be their best. And the more you do it, the more specialized you become, the more confident you become. The process itself brings up the level of competency for everyone that's involved. The vendor side, the customer side, us in-house, because we're constantly strategizing and looking for better and more efficient ways to scope. Is there low-hanging fruit here? Do we even test this? Or how do we look at this 700-page invoice of line items that's in a PDF and convert it into something that we can work with, and then figure out where the errors are? And we do it. We figure it out, and we standardize it, and then we train everybody on the team how to do it. So the first thing we do is break down the silos of internal communication with team members, right? Everybody comes to the table and learns the new ways of doing things, and discusses the strategy and shares their successes. And really, that's the only way that you can have a really good level of a success with this type of program, is to structure it that way. Right. Sorry, Robin, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, as well as, there's so much dependency on the digital processes that people believe they don't actually have to know the contracts or review them, because you have third-party systems running, maybe that they think, oh, well, this has the rates and the conditions and the schedules, and it'll process, and so there's no valid reason to work through it until you start to review it and you actually see, well, the system allows it because it's part of your contract, but you should not have been paying it in this instance. And so that's some of the key things that a knowledgeable person behind the digital process can bring to the table, because especially around for personal services, our resources, those digital processes can speed things along. But when you get into things like fuel, or you get into things like equipment, then you have to be more attuned to what really should you have been paying for, and is the description exactly meeting the contract terms or just outside of it. And you have to really be paying attention that a digital process that some of the third-party tools are bring don't capture it all. And so having companies and people actually reviewing what happens at the end of that digital cycle is a lot of value to the system.
Sure. And we're unfortunately coming to the end of the webinar, but there is one more question that someone's asked, and I think it's directed to you, Joanne. So do you use any track software to manage contractor spend? Contract terms and conditions are automatically applied through track software, so it takes the burden off contract knowledge. Do you guys use it?
We test it.
There you go. Yes.
Yes, Track is a great system. It's a great system for capturing labor and equipment billings, because like I said, you can align the contract terms with the data that's running through there. The labor piece is fed by the badging in and out at the gate. So those data points are the activity driver for the labor payments, but where the highest risk is found is in the materials module. And so that's where we focus our attention, because the labor and equipment modules can be aligned with contract terms. And as long as the person entering those terms is entering the correct contract, then you're probably, your likelihood of overpayments is low. But that materials module is the catch-all for everything else, right? So you have your subcontractor invoices, you have your third-party pass-through invoices, you have markup, and just everything else that may or may not be billable, like invoices for large amounts of consumables that are not allowed on the contract. They could be flowing through that track materials module. And so we have a way to test within that module, and we have found a minimum of 4% recovery within that module.
Yeah, and that's where I was going with it. We depend on the digital or the third-party tools. That's what I was referring to, Joanne. Thank you for elaborating on it. It's very good at people costs, right? Getting them through the gate. But you also have some other portions that just aren't as intuitive, like those lump sum fees or those costs or fuel or per diem or other things that get tacked on, MOB and DMOB, that may not be in effect for every single resource if they don't import them or input them correctly into the system, right? You still have to have a knowledgeable person behind the system, right? The system will only do what the system is supposed to do. It doesn't actually catch some of the bigger errors.
Exactly. And the charges running through track are coming in as allocations as well. So you could have 20 or 30 line items of charges that roll up into one invoice that supports it. And until you actually pull that invoice support and look at the chargeability, you can't really say that those charges were correct. So, that module specifically requires a deeper level of testing.
Sure. Well, there you have it, folks. That's unfortunately the end of the webinar, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank our amazing panelists. We really appreciate the time and effort that you've given to this webinar in the development of it and today. I also want to say thank you to listeners, as thank you for tuning in. I'm sure that you agree with me that what was provided on the webinar today is some really great insight and really some food for thought. So thanks for tuning in, and we hope that you found it just as useful. Just a quick reminder that this webinar is brought to you in connection with the Downstream Leadership Forum 2020, which the likes of CPRS are partnering with us on. And also, as I said, where the CEOs of Dow and Chemours and the likes of the executive board directors from Shell and BSF are coming together to create a more sustainable, resilient and smarter business downstream future. So we hope to see you there, and thanks for tuning in. Hope to stay safe. Thanks now. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Robin. Bye, Brian.
Bye,
Bye,
y'all.
Brian.
Bye, guys.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.